All right, good morning. Uh, as you know, today, Dr. Mujib Rahman Rahimi is going to talk about the impact of the constitutional choice in the failure of state building in Afghanistan. Dr. Mujib is a well-known writer, politician, diplomat, and translator in Afghanistan. He has been the spokesman of chief executive in the past government of Afghanistan, and so this talk is important for us because it has two different, excellence. First, part of this talk would be the result of Dr. Mujib's researches on Afghanistan politics and political situation. And secondly, the next part of this talking would be the experience of Dr. Mujib Rahman Rahimi as a person who was witness of most of the, political events within the government in the state of Afghanistan during the last 12 or 14 or maybe 20 years. So join us to offer Dr. Mujib Rahman Rahimi. Dear Dr. Rahimi, welcome to our class, and thank you for being here. So Mike is with you, and you can start your talking.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasir Aryan, coordinator and manager of this lecture series at Penn State University, dear students and participants. Welcome to today's event and discussion. As usual, I begin by thanking Dr. Aryan, the History Department, and the Center for Global Studies for organizing today's lecture, debate, and frank discussion on Afghanistan. I was asked a while ago to talk about history of Afghanistan, as the title of the course is. However, at the end, I was asked if I could focus on most recent events and talk on the causes of the collapse of the Republic and failure of the international coalition led by US and Afghanistan. Hence, I chose to focus or decided to focus on the impact of constitutional choice on the failure of state building with state formation in Afghanistan in the last 20 or so years. My speech is divided into two parts. Of course, parts will be providing the context and then theoretical aspects of the topic, and also some of my experiences, as Dr. Aryan pointed out, as someone who worked in the government for a long time. I try to be brief and short and leave enough space for questions and your intervention if needed. So before moving to the theoretical framework, I think it's important to provide some contexts in terms of Afghanistan. Afghanistan has a unique and troubled socio-political history. I am sure in your course with Dr. Aryan, you have developed a good knowledge of the country. US entered Afghanistan without any pre-planned, along with international partners and international community, to take revenge after the 9/11 attacks on US targets executed by Al-Qaeda and harbored or supported by Taliban. At that time, the policy or the decision makers in the United States had little knowledge of the country and its socio-political and military dynamics. The US and the West had abandoned Afghanistan after the demise of the Soviet Union and the withdrawal of the Soviet forces from Afghanistan, and a new era of internal conflict began in the country, which ultimately led to the emergence of the Taliban and their takeover. Throughout, it is in this sudden decision the US relied on Afghan diaspora living in the US and empowered a number of individuals throughout its prisons. Here is an example. I can refer to Dr. Zalmay Khalilzad. You know him and the role he played in Afghanistan, Dr. Ashraf Ghani, Ahmad Zai, who became later the president, and a group of their colleagues. I refer to them as friends of Beirut American University. To my understanding, their advice and their influence in the process was misleading not only to the US and Western policymakers, but it had a direct rule on the failure of the Republic at the end. The process of state building and nation building by US and Western countries, of course, needs a detailed discussion, debate, and analysis. It was not well studied, and it was not well planned, and it was not very consistent since the intervention to Afghanistan. Conflicting decisions and messages from the West, especially from the United States, similar to the war and policies on terror and terrorism, was projected on the state building and nation building in the country. That led to a lot of misperceptions internally. You remember some of the US presidents clearly stated that they are not there for nation building, state building, or imposing their way of life on the people of Afghanistan, while at the beginning, there was a clear message that we are here for nation building, state building, and helping the Afghans to go through a transition to stability, democratization, and a stable country in the region. The Iraq War was another major issue. It had a major impact on Afghanistan. Resources and attention was diverted to Iraq, and Afghanistan was left with little forces and resources. The process of democratization, state building, and nation building in Afghanistan was imposed from above. It was not the natural outcome of a long-term philosophical and socio-economic changes in Afghanistan. It was imposed by a foreign force, then by the support of the United Nations, in a country completely unfamiliar with the Western democratic values, norms, and principles, after going through a long time of internal conflicts, beginning with the Mujahideen and then followed by the Taliban. Of course, a lot has been written on the causes of the failure. However, the causes of the failure generally can be divided, to my understanding, into three broad categories: internal, regional, and international. Several studies, books, and articles have been published since the collapse of the Republic by government-sponsored commissions, scholars, researchers, and specialists of Afghanistan affairs. As an example, I can refer here to the study Why the Afghan Government Collapsed by Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, known as SIGA. In a detailed report, it broadly mentions 6 factors contributed to the collapse of the former republic in Afghanistan in August 2021. First, the Afghan government failed to recognize that the United States would actually leave Afghanistan with its Western allies. Second, the exclusion of the Afghan government from the US-Taliban talks weakened and undermined the Afghan government. Third, despite its weakened position, the Afghan government, led by Dr. Ghani, insisted that the Taliban be effectively integrated into the republic, making the progress on peace and negotiations very difficult. Fourth, the Taliban were unwilling to compromise. The US-Taliban agreement emboldened the insurgent group, which subsequently led to the collapse of the republic. Fifth, former Afghan President Ashraf Ghani governed through a highly selective, narrow cycle of loyalists, destabilizing the government at a critical juncture. Finally, the Afghan government's high level of centralization, endemic corruption, and struggle to attain legitimacy were long-term contributors to its eventual collapse. Others have added several other factors and dimensions to the causes of the failure, especially focused on the regional and national dimensions, especially the role of Pakistan, and the later stage, the role of Iran, Russia, and the entire region, who were opposing the democratic process in Afghanistan and were not letting the process to succeed, because it was in oath with the entire establishment in the region, and the level of freedom of press, and the success of the model in Afghanistan was not favoring neither Pakistan, Iran, Central Asian republics with dictators, and also the Russia and China in the region. So all of them, on one hand, were realizing that the US is fighting Taliban and radicals, which ultimately support their long-term interest in stability in the region. And on the other hand, they were opposing the success of the US and were not allowing the process to succeed, and were creating hurdles. In line with the last point raised in the Seeger report, which is the high level of centralization, in today's discussion, taking into account the time and space, I only focus on the constitutional choice as one of the factors of the failure. I have published 2 works on Afghanistan. Both are related to the issue of state, nation building, and constitutional choice. I will refer to both works, to one very briefly, and to the second in some details, and ask you to read my book if you find time. If you intend to critically engage with the literature on Afghanistan. Sadly, the literature on Afghanistan is a colonial heritage, or mainly influenced by the Afghan nationalism, mainly constructed by the Afghan government. And it is hard to find critical studies in Afghan history, politics, or the narratives constructed by the state, and then copied by some of the Western scholars or researchers. Exceptionally, in the last 10 years, we are witnessing a new group of emerging scholars challenging the dominant narrative. So I begin with my book, which is titled Deconstructing the Official Discourse of State Formation in Afghanistan. It's published by Ivy Teuris in London and New York. And a new title they choose for their interest, how to sell the book, find the market for it, under the title of State Formation in Afghanistan, a Theoretical and Political History. However, before going to the details of the book, I would like to bring to your attention as students. I mean, I consider myself a student, but going back to years of studying at the University of Essex in UK. After I moved to University of Essex and joined the Department of Government, I became familiar with critical thinking, discourse analysis, and critical methods of inquiry and research. That helped me to change. I consider that cornerstone in my research and writing. Since then, I stopped repeating and reproducing the past, or staying loyal to what I was knowing or what I was taught in Afghanistan. Since then, I have taken on several controversial issues, such as the Afghan political system, the issue of identity and history in Afghanistan, the Shia-Sunni divide, the essentially contested concepts in the country, the concept of Khilafat and governance in Islam, the concept of civil society organizations in Afghanistan and their role. And last but not the least was my Ph.D. thesis, Deconstructing the Official Narrative of State Formation in Afghanistan. My first publication on the issue of state formation in Afghanistan is titled "The Impact of Constitutional Choice on Democratic Consolidation in Conflict Management and Divided Societies." So the title of the book tells a lot about what I was intending to do in my research. My assumption is that Afghanistan is a divided society and it requires constitutional design, a framework to accommodate the newly emerged players, increase political inclusivity and political representation, which in turn would guarantee political stability. In this book, I theoretically and empirically argue against the exclusive centralized presidential system, of course, against the Emirate of the Taliban, with single winner and many losers in a post-conflict society, and argue in favor of a decentralized, inclusive parliamentary or political system. Slowly and gradually, I became aware of the fault lines of the story we were told, who we are as a nation and as a state, how we emerged, struggled, survived, and developed, and who we are now. It was bothering me, but I was not sure how to deal with it. One day, I remember I was reading an article by Professor David Owen, professor of social and political philosophy at the University of Southampton, on ideological captivity. Shortly, he argues that there are two sorts of captivity, physical and ideological. And then he divides the latter to ideological and aspectival captivities. To me, that was the moment of ignition to embark on a long journey of problematizing the official discourse of state formation in Afghanistan. I realized that we are captive of a narrative mainly constructed by power in Afghanistan. They want to influence us. They want to shape our understanding of ourselves, the others in the society. So that led to 5 years of research at the University of Essex during my Ph.D. I employed the theory of discourse and discourse analysis, which we call it the School of Essex at the University of Essex. This provided the right tool for me to do the research. The book mainly covers the narrative of state in Afghanistan, its emergence, development, and sophistication. Theoretically, as I mentioned, I relied on Lacklow and Move theory of discourse. I combine other tools with the discourse theory, mainly Derrida's double reading theory, and then also based on Derrida's insight, first time I attempted to reconstruct very faithfully the official narrative of state formation in Afghanistan, how it emerged, developed, and reached a hegemonic level. I relied on primary sources available in Farsi, Pashto, and English. And the second move, or the second reading, as Derrida put it, I attempted to deconstruct the official narrative. I also debated the impact of colonial knowledge on the literature of state formation in Afghanistan, the reproduction of colonial knowledge by the Afghan state, its convergence with the Afghan or Pashtun-centric state-sponsored nationalism, with colonial and post-colonial discourses, and the entire narrative and discourse of state formation, which is, of course, power-related, contingent, and exposed to dislocatory events, as we call it in the discourse theory, has based on the master signifier of Afghanistan and Afghans in three intertwined related signifiers or nodal points, as we call them. The moment of emergence, the notion of Jirga or Loya Jirga, and the concept of invasion and resistance. These are the dominant themes in the history of state formation in the country. This book is shortly organized in 6 chapters. It begins with the theoretical framework, In the second chapter, I reconstruct the official discourse from 1880 to 2010. And then in the third chapter, I reconstruct the discourse of state formation in English literature on Afghanistan. Then on the fourth and fifth, I moved to problematize and create questions after constructing that image or that picture. I tried to deconstruct and make that image shaky and blurry and create questions for the reader to look differently into the history of Afghanistan and state formation. So first I use historiography, treaties, cartographies, and atlases to problematize the official discourse of state formation in Afghanistan. In the fifth chapter, I go to the period of dislocation, diversification, and decolonization of the official discourse of state formation in Afghanistan. This period, of course, emerged in the last 10, 15 years. A lot of new scholars emerged, and they have questioned the history of Afghanistan. And I have identified all the scholars in the book in my literature review, and also the beginning of the sources in my PhD, and also in the fifth chapter. At the end, I argue for transforming from a radical antagonism to a plural agonism in Afghanistan, where we are captive of that nationalism and not only in trouble with ourselves, but with the rest of the world. So I'm arguing in favor of common civilizational sphere, which includes the entire region known as Iran, historical Iran, not the Islamic Republic of Iran, the historical Iran, where we have a lot of things in common, as you can see that in the case of European Union. And then I explain in details how we can transform to that to the new period. So this, of course, provides a context of what is going on in Afghanistan to bring us to the second phase, which is the impact of constitutional choice. In the constitutional choice, theoretically, I rely on new institutionalism and combine it with few other tools. So the question is how the democratization and transition to democracy can take place in post-conflict divided societies such as Afghanistan. Do we have a single prescription, or it depends on each case and on each context? The transition to democracy is well explained, as you might know it, through modernization theory or approach, structural approach, and also through transitional approaches. Of course, as I mentioned in my remarks at the beginning, in case of Afghanistan, the democratization and the change in the last 20 years was not the outcome of modernity and then moving to democracy, as we have the case in Europe or in US, or major democracies or stable democracies or developed countries. And of course, in liberal tradition, and also not the outcome of a structural change as we have it in Marxism theories. But transitional approaches can explain that. There are a lot of arguments that nations should not or cannot wait for years to go through that transition and become democratic. There are ways that they can move to that. So I try to explore that option and explain how Afghanistan moved to democratization process after the US invasion and entrance with the international coalition, the UN, and how transition theories explain that. Of course, the question I was concerned the most was, is there any correlation between political institution in the process of democratic consolidation, development, stability, and conflict management, especially in countries with ethnic and religious divide? I relied on the theory of new institutionalism in comparative politics. This theory holds a premise that political democracy not only depends on economic and social conditions, but also on the design of political institutions. The political institutions, it argues, are political actors in their own rights. Of course, under political behavioralism, there were arguments that institutions are neutral, they don't play any role, but that has been challenged. And new institutionalism argues that institutions are key players, key factors. They are political actors on their own. Hence, to my understanding, the Constitution provides the basic rule and incentives concerning the institutions and government formation, the conditions under which governments rule and democratically can be changed. It creates the overall system of incentives and organizations within which the entire democratic process and different types of democracies structured and processed. Therefore, the constitutional choice is crucially important for long-term prospect of democratic consolidation, stability, and conflict management, especially in divided societies. And different institutions in different institutional forms, rules and practices can have major consequences for the degree of democracy and the operation of the system. As an example, if you take the case of Northern Ireland or some other divided countries, you implement a very democratic system there, the outcome will be a dictatorship, a majoritarian rule. So with the shifts and changes in the post-1990s, a lot of theories and ideas emerged, such as cultural recognition, the politics of recognition, multiculturalism, and also the idea of constitutional choice or constitutional design for divided societies. We know that in the post-colonial period, majority of the independent states who got their independence from the colonial powers, they copied the colonial powers. If they had a presidential system, they copied the presidential system, as we see it in Africa, who followed the model of France, and some followed the model of the British democracy. But later on, it was emerged that copying a model or a constitution will not resolve the problem of a country if you don't pay attention to the real problems of that country and draft something which reflects the reality and can accommodate the vices of that nation or that divided society. Of course, it was after this that the idea of constitutional design emerged, and there are different case studies, and there's questions which system can foster democracy and manage conflict better in a divided society. What that democratic consolidation means. We have a great debate on parliamentary versus presidential system. Of course, the definitions of each of these systems, parliamentary versus presidential, semi-presidential system. As you know, in the majority of the Western countries, with the exception of Switzerland, we either have a parliamentary system, a presidential, or a semi-presidential system. But in Afghanistan, we historically, of course, we had a monarchy and then a transition through coup d'etat to a republic. And then the communists took power, and we had a Russian model of democratic system, they used to call it, then the Mujahideen, then the Taliban. But in all of these changes, we had the president and the prime minister. Even under the first Taliban, there was, I mean, as it is now, there was the leader heading somewhere, and then they had as acting prime minister or prime minister someone in Kabul. So we have also a great debate, I would call it, on the merits of these systems, which can help better a divided country. like advantages of presidential system and disadvantages of presidential system versus the parliamentary system. To make it more related to Afghanistan case, the Western countries, after they came to Afghanistan, and through a process which I mentioned later, they decided to, they adopted a presidential system of government, which was not very familiar with the Afghan people or with its history. So I cannot go to the details, but there's some of the disadvantages of the presidential system theoretically is, I mean, if I mention it, then I relate that to, in a later part of my speech to Afghanistan, is competing claims of legitimacy between the president and the parliament, as you have it between the president and Congress in the United States, deadlock and conflict between executive and legislative, the fixed term of office for the president, winner takes all or zero-sum election, possibility of coup d'etats, the problem of succession, self-image of the president, I mean, identified winners and losers, polarization of the election process, weak cabinet, dependent ministers, limited representation, the likelihood of political outsiders to come to power. We have witnessed that recently in US elections and in some other countries. Style of presidential politics, presidential, I mean, the personality of the president or the leader, a rivalry between the president and the legislator, combining the double rule of head of the state and head of the government, political crisis in presidential system means regime crisis, and strong link between presidential system and what is termed as delegative democracy, which I will elaborate further on. And also the question of stability, survival, governance, and parties under the two system. There are a lot of debates, and statistically, empirical research indicates that a decentralized parliamentary system is more conducive for stability, survival, governance, and political parties, rather than a very centralized political system. So this was a very quick overview of my theoretical framework to discuss the constitutional choice and its impact on the failure of state building in Afghanistan. So now I move to the second part of the debate, which is, does Afghanistan qualify as a divided society? If Afghanistan is not a divided society, or any country, then and there is no ethnic, religious, or major political divide, then the very question of constitutional choice is irrelevant. Any type of constitution or constitutional choice might work for that country. But if a country is divided ethnically and politically and religiously, then if it qualifies as a divided society, then the question of designing a constitution or choosing the right constitution is very crucial in the success of that country. We have experiences in all developing and developed countries where you have ethnic divide. They were divided, but through constitutional design, they managed that and they adopted different models and they passed that stage. So in divided societies, we have very divided. We have countries that are only divided. And in case of Afghanistan, the studies and also the statistics indicate that it is a divided country. The major ethnic groups in Afghanistan, Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks, they have their own history, they have their own culture. There are some common things between them, but Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic society. 70 plus languages, ethnicities, but the political divide between the major ethnic groups has a long history, by the Pashtuns being dominant after the establishment of Afghanistan in the post-colonial era after 1880s. Before that, of course, we don't have a nation state in Afghanistan, so the concept was imposed by then the British Empire in the region, and Afghanistan was not an exception to that. Of course, in our official history, we don't say, we claim that Afghanistan existed as a nation state for 5,000 years. But the reality is this paradigm of nation states was even something new in Europe, and it was extended to include Afghanistan in that region by colonialism. So we have a post-colonial nation state, which when the British win, and when they went through subcontinent, and the first ethnic group they encountered were the Pashtuns or Afghans, and they become the dominant force in the country. So gradually and slowly, they imposed their narrative of state formation and who Afghanistan is, what Afghanistan is and how the identity of the country should be recognized nationally and internationally. So, and with that process, I mean, as it is explained in discourse theory, they try to marginalize and force other ethnic groups and their discourses and their ideals to the margin of the society. Of course, after the Russian invasion in Afghanistan and the withdrawal, but I argue that there was a moment of dislocation where all societies and groups, they migrated to neighboring countries. They found, access to weapons, money, support, and they re-emerged as dominant powers, challenging the Pashtun hegemony. And then that led to the internal conflict and a period, what I call it, hegemonic crisis, which continues until now, even after the Taliban return. So generally, Afghanistan, as I mentioned, it is multi-ethnic, multi-language, and a diverse country with a long history of internal domination, marginalization, suppression, and internal conflict over power and resources. So in the post-Russian and post-Russian period, the question of identity and ethnicity also become dominant because the other groups, they were of the opinion that they've been discriminated against by Pashtuns in the formation of the nation state, the symbols of the state, and also in the identity of the country. So a lot of challenging and conflicting ideas emerged through this time. And the main cause of that, as I argued, is the Afghan nationalism, which is mainly constructed by Pashtun elite, and it is exclusionary. It does not accommodate the rest of the ethnicities in Afghanistan. And they are of the opinion that they've been deprived of their right, even beginning with the name of Afghanistan, which means only Pashtuns. And there are arguments that the country should be called Khorasan, which doesn't have any ethnic connotation, and it refers to the historical, prosperous era in the history of Afghanistan, which would include all the ethnicities in the country. Finally, Afghanistan, there's no national census. We tried to have one, we failed. The Pashtuns are arguing that they're the majority, and the others are the minority, and based on that, they are claiming to have their share of power. But all the studies and statistics indicate that there is no majority in Afghanistan, and it is hard to prove in the absence of a national census acceptable to all groups that there is a majority. And recent studies also show that it is a country of ethnic minorities. It has a long history of conflict and internal confrontations. So according to all the definitions of divided societies, to my understanding, Afghanistan qualifies as a divided country and as a post-conflict nation. So in post-conflict nations, as I mentioned, there is a need for constitutional choice, which, to my understanding, maximizes the number of winners and minimizes the number of losers. In the absence in internal conflicts, civil war, you have a proliferation of new actors who are very powerful, dominant, they have access to resources, money, men, and they're powerful players. So in the reconciliation process or in the transition process to a stable country, you need to adopt a constitution which maximizes the number of winners, not minimize the number and make a lot of losers. Otherwise, they will not lead the process to succeed. So Afghanistan as a divided society, to my understanding, needed an inclusive political system or political settlement. But sadly, after the Bonn Agreement of 2001, Afghanistan went to adopt a new constitutional framework. The Bonn Agreement predicted that there will be a constitutional commission, and the commission will be formed, and then they draft the constitution. Then there will be a constitutional review commission, which happened with a lot of intervention from political parties and groups to include their own representatives in the commission. And the commission, because of the first commission, I think it proposed, it proposed the semi-presidential system, but at that time, President Karzai and also the vice president, they interfered directly and forced the reviewing commission to adopt the presidential system based mainly on the American model. There were a lot of objections from the people, from academia, and they said Afghanistan is not familiar with this system, it will lead to dictatorship, but it was not accepted. So finally, the government interfered, the president interfered, and then they adopted a very centralized presidential system. So we had the king before in Afghanistan in the 1940s. In the new constitution, what I understand, they changed the name of the king to a president, and the president enjoyed all the powers of the king. It was directly elected by the people, and the parliament, of course, was elected separately. So now you have here that the issue of legitimacy, because each of them claim that they are representing the people, the parliament, and also the president directly. And in such cases, the entire state apparatus, the judiciary, the parliament, and the rest of it in post-colonial cases, take the Latin America and Africa, Asian countries, they become subordinate to the president, and the president turns to a dictator. So the only wishful thinking is that you have someone good as a president. Otherwise, he is the king, and he will exercise his powers, and especially in post-conflict societies or in divided societies, that will lead to conflict. So the case of Afghanistan under the 2004 constitution, my prediction was it is a story of success or failure. And I predicted in my work that if the system is not changed, it will lead to a failure in Afghanistan. Then in 2020, I edited the book because the book was published several times in Afghanistan. It became one of the reference books. The majority of the researchers and students knew me through that book when I went to Afghanistan in 2015 and worked as a government spokesperson. So I edited the book again in 2020, a year before of the collapse, and I reviewed my findings and I reiterated that the issue still continues, and if it is not changed, it will be one of the causes of the failure, because from the first day of the constitution, under the President Karzai, and also under President Ghali, we had this competing claim of legitimacy. The president was telling, I am representing the people as a head of the state, head of the government. The parliament was saying, we are representing the people, and the president was not paying any attention to the parliament. And the deadlock and conflict between the executive and legislature continued nonstop for the last 20 years. It has a long story. I can't go to the detail. The fixed term of the president meant that no one can change the president. It was well known that President Karzai was incompetent and Ghani at the same time, but there was no solution how to fix the issue. In this system, winner took everything. It was a zero-sum game. Anyone allied with the president, when he won the election, of course, whoever was in power, he managed to win the second term. And you know the famous story of rigging an election and very organized rigging, and the issue had world coverage. So in elections, we had very clear losers and winners, opposing to what I said, and that in post-conflict societies, we need to maximize the number of winners, and minimize the number of losers. It worked the other way around. So we had a few winners, mainly Afghan diasporas who returned from the United States, were allies of the international coalition of Americans, and the majority of the people, the new players in the game, they lost. Self-image was an issue. The arrogant and the way the president was acting from Karzai to Ghani, and it got worse under President Ghani, identified polarization of the election process. It became a very divisive issue, not only in the presidential election, but also in the parliamentary elections, of course, with corruption and rigging. The Afghan diasporas, like President Karzai and Ghani, who had no political parties, no political base in the country, they tried to play the ethnic card during the election. As you know, politicians do play certain cards. And that polarized the process, which damaged the entire process and stability in the country. And we had a very weak cabinet, because under the constitution, the president was not responsible to the parliament because he was elected directly by the people. Even that system of checks and balance was very weak in the constitution. Impeachment process was very complicated, especially in third world countries. If you're in power, you have access to resources, then it would be extremely hard to be impeached by anyone. So the ministers were responsible to the parliament. The parliament had the right to impeach them, vote of confidence, no confidence, and that led to a very weak cabinet, and at the same time to a lot of corruption as well. The dependency of ministers was also an issue. The president had to choose them, and he had the right to choose them, and then they had to depend on the president. We ended up under the system with the limited representation, and also style of the presidential politics was a major issue, especially with President Ghani. He was claiming to be head of the state and also the chief executive and also the chief commander of the armed forces. And then that gave him an image or a style that would not, of course, consider others as equal or listen to their views. Last but not least is the link between these presidential systems and the delegative democracy. It is developed by Latin Americans, tourists. It mainly says that In delegative democracy, people are mobilized in a couple of days. They go and vote and choose someone as a father figure as their president, and everything is assigned to him for another 5 to 7 years. Then he decides what to do, what to not. The major center of power in delegative democracy is the presidential palace. The rest are just a show. The legislative, the judiciary, the rest of the government institutions, just they are there to guarantee the legitimacy of the president. And we ended at the last days of the President Ghani exactly to this. Plus, plus the identity crisis, the ethnic divide, we had the issue of elections. In elections, we ended up the opposing camp of President Karzai at the beginning, which led by Dr. Abdullah, and 2 elections under President Ghani. So he got the majority of the votes. But now all the evidence and the leaked documents indicate that he won the election. But they rigged the election. They didn't allow him to become the president because of that ethnic issues and historical rivalries I mentioned in a divided society like Afghanistan. So under President Ghani, to resolve the issue, we ended up to have a coalition government, the president and the office of the chief executive. So Dr. Abdullah's camp was arguing for a parliamentary system with a prime minister, while the President Ghani's camp was campaigning for keeping the centralized system as it is in the constitution. So under the new system and with the support of international law, international coalition, international forces, especially the US, a couple of other things happened in the country. One was that the government position and posts were divided on the percentage of the existence or influence of the ethnic groups. So major rules were given to Pashtuns, followed by Tajiks and by Hazaras, and then by Uzbeks. So it included the armed forces, and of course, positive discrimination privilege was given to women as well to come to politics and to parliament. So this also prevented, access to equal opportunities, the principle of merit-based government or meritocracy, then it led to quotas to each ethnic group, and that was claimed by political leaders, and that led to a lot of issues and corruptions. But because of the deadline, the deadlock in the issues in the election, there was a compromise, and then that led to a coalition, establishment of a coalition between the 2 parties. Of course, the president had the upper hand because he had the power constitutional to sign everything. An agreement was signed in the first term, and 2014 election, he did not respect that term of agreement. And that led to many crises. We had the presidential palace and the office of the chief executive. And majority of the time within that 5 period of the term of the president was, of course, spent on internal rivalries. The president tried to marginalize Dr. Abdullah, negotiated with his political supporters. He offered bribes, money, positions for them. And then he tried to marginalize Dr. Abdullah himself. And then, of course, there was reactions, and that led to a lot of crises. We were not able to form the government for a long time. Ministers would be rejected. So the president, in order to marginalize Dr. Abdullah, he created a mechanism in the presidential palace, commissions, that he monopolized the political, the economic, and the financial powers. There was advisors, commissions in the palace, or controlling these 3 things. And it continued to the last days of his presidency. And if Dr. Abdullah had appointed a minister, he would appoint the deputy prime minister, then the deputy minister. That deputy minister would be close to the president, and he would of course, would not listen, would not see, and would not respect the minister with his team. And that led to, some of the ministries, they're there to deliver. That led to dismissal of many ministers and deadlocks and crises. And at the end, the Americans, the message was clear that we don't need an election in 2019, and they were asking for a coalition and then peace talks. But President Ghani insisted, and then we ended up in another election crisis, which continued for a long time, again, rigging and issues. But this time, because of the efforts of the opposition parties and the introduction of biometrics in the election system, it was reduced from millions to a couple of 100,000. But again, a new coalition was formed. The president became the president, and then his rival, Dr. Abdullah, he assumed the position of chairman of the High Council for National Reconciliation. But that divide in that crisis continued, and which finally led to the collapse of the Republic. So to conclude, my understanding is that the choice of the constitution in the case of Afghanistan, in the case of this divided country, played a major role in the collapse of the Republic. If you had a decentralized system, more exclusive, which respected the rule of local players, provinces, communities, it would have strengthened the government and supported the process. Because we went for a very exclusionary presidential system with a lot of powers at the hand of the president, he would appoint everyone irrespective of the choice of the people, their concerns, and this way the gap between the center and the periphery, the provinces, the people increased. And at the end of the day, that led to the collapse of the system. Taliban, unfortunately, followed the same mistakes, the same steps with another centralized system, which will, to my understanding, will not continue, and it will collapse sooner or later. So that was my presentation. I hope I did justice to some of these complicated issues. If there is any question or any intervention, I would be pleased to listen, or if there is anything I can contribute to answer, that would be welcomed, and I try my best to present, to express my views.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rahimi. It was really interesting lecture for me, and I believe it was interesting for the students. So I have a question, but I will ask it after your question. If you have anything to share or to ask.
If there are any questions from your side, I would be more than happy to express my views. Maybe from, I leave the space open for you, from my work in the government, from my research, or anything you're interested, something related to the course, or maybe anything I could not explain during the presentation.
So we've been studying the history of the Afghan region from a few hundred years to more recently, and it seems that no matter what happens, every ethnic or religious radicalized group in the region is only united for a short period to a foreign power's invasion. How would you suggest that they get past these somewhat primitive divides and realize we're all human? It doesn't matter our ethnic background or our religion. We can unite now. Why can't we stay united after the foreign oppressor is defeated?
That's a very good question, and what they say is a $1 million question that no one can resolve it. Basically, you have to look into the history of Afghanistan and history of the region, the development and the changes, the paradigm shifts took place there. To my understanding, when the Russians moved to Central Asia from that direction, and the French went to some parts of Iran, and the British through the subcontinent, and they moved to Afghanistan, but at the end they decided to create a buffer state. That buffer state, through some mechanisms the British established in mainly in the border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, that time the Indian subcontinent, and the Iron Hand or the Iron Curtain Russians created on Om River, that excluded Afghanistan from becoming part of the Russian Empire or Russian political, financial, social, and cultural system, and also prevented Afghanistan from becoming part of the Western political, economic, and cultural, or that colonial heritage usually India or Pakistan enjoys. So they created a buffer zone, supported certain individuals. At the beginning, Abdurrahman Khan saying that, look, we provide you subsidies, you govern this area, do not impose any trouble for us, contain the elements who are causing trouble for subcontinent or for Russia, and at the same time, you are free, you can do whatever you want inside Afghanistan. I can see, by the way, the repeat of that policy with the Taliban. Look, a terrorist group like Taliban. I mentioned to the conflicting messages from the Western countries on the issue of state building. So they were of the opinion that Taliban are terrorists. This is how they started their war. They harbored Al-Qaeda and blah, blah. But later on, it turns to insurgency. In a later stage, they negotiated with them, excluded the Afghan government, and then they signed the Doha Agreement. Now, the message from the international community to the Taliban, despite their policies against women, despite the atrocities they have committed against the Afghan people and against the international community, US and Europe, and despite their harsh interpretation of religion, Islam, and the policies in the country, the message to them is, okay, especially against women, okay, contain the situation within Afghanistan, do not pose any threats to us, cut off your links with Al-Qaeda, do not harbor terrorist groups, so do whatever you want. They're sending them 45 million something weekly to keep the economy stable. At that time, a similar scenario was constructed. And that led to keeping Afghanistan backward. It neither became part of the Russian establishment. Look, you go to Central Asia, see Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, these new Central Asian republics. Compare their economy, their infrastructure, their culture, the level of development to Afghanistan. And move to Pakistan, India, despite the problems they have, and compare that to Afghanistan. So it was kept very backward. I'm not saying that the population in Afghanistan are equally backward to that level, but that led to, exclusion of the country from becoming part of any of these dominant systems. And subsequently, the Russian invasion and the 40 plus years war, it has, led to many setbacks. Sometimes you have these major ideologies which unite the people. For example, the communists were united under the umbrella of Marxism, as you would know it. And then the Mujahideen, they were united under the umbrella of jihad against the Russian invasion in Afghanistan. But then and now the Taliban were united under that umbrella of jihad with many other ethnic and tribal dimensions. But once that area is passed, then new issues will emerge. That's why I termed that this era and the time before that hegemonic crisis, the era of hegemonic crisis in Afghanistan. There is no dominant narrative. In the absence of a dominant narrative, usually ethnic issues will emerge, the identity and the rights based on multiculturalism, on ethnicity, they become dominant. In Afghanistan, especially in the case of Afghanistan, the government was controlling everything. The government had a monopoly over information, over state structure, over education system, over publication, over press. I mean, there was no freedom of nothing. But now, after the Russian invasion, let's accept that as a beginning of dislocation in Afghanistan, as we use it in discourse theory. So then the people are asking themselves who we are and what is this land? Is the state, is the country, or does the state, the country represent us? Or we are represented in there or not? If they see clearly that they are not represented, the diversity of Afghanistan, the culture of Afghanistan, the ethnic groups of Afghanistan are not represented in the state symbol, in the state structure. So then you have this struggle for recognition, and at the same time, a constant move for suppression. When there is a rupture, when there is a dislocation, usually the new emerging forces want to move forward, construct new narratives based on justice, equality, inclusivity, and the rest of it. But the dominant force, who was a hegemonic force before the dislocation, they want to return back. They want to return back to the normal or the time they were dominant. But they try to present the change and the new emerging forces as anti-peace, anti-stability, or forces of rebellion against the state, with the aim to return back. I mean, that struggle continues to a stage, to a level, who would be dominant. So my argument, to answer your question directly, is that if you had a state, if you had the leadership who accepted the diversity of Afghanistan and based on that diversity recognized the identity, the culture, the diversity of the people and their presence in the political system, in the state, in the government, that would have led to more unity and, to a process which, led to, what you term it, to something normal based on meritocracy, based on equal opportunities. Of course, you cannot eliminate the element of race, ethnicity, but there are ways. People are recognized and respected. But look at the Taliban, for example, now. Ethnically, it is one group. Then within mainly Pashtuns and male, but within the Pashtuns, you have a couple of tribes of Duranis who are dominant. And then you have some tribes of the Gholjai Pashtuns led by Haqqani network. So they are in conflict, in constant struggle between themselves. The Tajiks are eliminated from the government. They are not their asshole. The Uzbeks are eliminated from the government. The Hazaras, because of their Shia beliefs or mazhab, they have been completely, eliminated from the structure of the state as we had it in the last 20 years. So which was moving to the right direction despite many problems. Women, for example, they've been eliminated. The progress we had, and because of the mistakes we made, because of the wrong policies of our allies, especially the United States. So you have one ethnic group, and within that one ethnic group, some segments of that ethnic group, they are dominant. So how we would expect that people get united and move forward, while they don't see themselves there is no election, no will of people, and they are discriminated against. And that's why the Taliban, despite their efforts and trying all means, they fail to find legitimacy and acceptance in the society. Sorry, I went more than I should have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rahimi. There were, many questions, and we were too interested to ask those questions and see what your own experience was from the previous government. But unfortunately, we do not have time. I only want to ask one question to see your own experience, not, it means that not we do not need the answer of that question from your researchers, just from your own experience. I was listening to one of your interviews with one of the TV channels in Kabul that was before the 2014 election. And there were some issues about the mental health of the President Ghani. So one day before the collapse of the government, President Ghani was, he was insisting on resistance, and he was saying that no one would be able to defeat the military force of the government. And another day we saw that President Ghani fled and Taliban came to Kabul. So what do you think, what your experience says, what was the main cause of this rapid collapse, other than those factions and those reasons that you mentioned during this talk?
It is a complicated and multi-layered issue. I mean, to do justice, we have to discuss many aspects. But I mean, no doubt that President Ghani, in a style of governance, was one of the reasons. He was surrounded by a close circle of loyalists, and to that group, Amrullah Saleh, the vice president, was added. I think the president was not given the right information. He was, I mean, to my understanding, he was not understanding the reality and the gravity of the situation. I remember that the message from our Western allies was that, okay, we will not make a final decision under President Trump, and the next president will make a decision. Once Biden came to power, President Ghani's perception and his allies was that now we have someone from within the state in the US as a president. Now the United States will not be governed by Twitter or by an individual who has no experience of running a country. So the establishment will now be in charge. So they were of the opinion that all those hurdles and challenges they had under President Trump is now behind them, and a new era will start. Of course, there were some positive messages from Friends of Afghanistan in the Congress, Army, maybe in the intelligence services. But the perception in our camp, where I was working with Dr. Abdullah, was completely opposite. We knew the gravity of the situation. And Dr. Abdullah was of the opinion that President Biden has a negative perception of Afghanistan. And once he is in power, he will do something wrong. He will make a decision. And of course, I mean, veterans of war, officials in the US administration, majority of them, they were kind, they were supportive, but they were expressing themselves very honestly, saying that, okay, in our system, the president will make the final decision, not us. So you need to make peace with Taliban while we are here, before that decision is made. Once we heard that, I mean, I was in several of those meetings when Secretary of State Blinken would call Dr. Abdullah and tell him the progress, that, okay, there is a close circle of us around the president. We were debating and discussing what to do. So once they made the decision that they would leave, then that was a shock wave to President Ghani, because he was not prepared for that. But before that, a lot of people went to President Ghani, warned him that, including Dr. Abdullah, the former president, Karzai, Abdurrab Rasul Sayyaf, in the latest stage, Yunus Qanuni, the former vice president, Atta, and a group of influential leaders. They went to Ghani and told him that the situation is not as good as you think. I mean, as you mentioned rightly, he was saying, I'm the chief of army staff, I will fight, and no matter Americans leave, they should leave tomorrow, we will fight them, we will break the back of the Taliban. And I mean, he was appearing and delivering all those speeches.